Greetings again everyone, and today I'm taking another trip back into Nikon territory to look at a lens for their full-frame mirrorless Z mount cameras, the Nikon Z 24mm f1.8s. It costs about $1,000 and about £1,000 in the UK. That's definitely an expensive price for an f1.8 lens, but it's worth bearing in mind that Canon, Sony and Nikon's equivalent f1.4 lenses cost a lot more. So if this lens turns out to be excellent, then professionals might consider it a reasonable price. I'd like to thank Nikon UK for letting me borrow this lens for a couple of weeks for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. We'll be looking at its strengths and weaknesses. I love the 24mm focal length on a full frame camera. It's a very wide angle, right on the verge of ultra wide angle territory, so you get a lovely dramatic image here with a slight stretching away of your corners. But it's not so wide that your images become difficult to compose or that your subject gets pushed too far away. It's pretty useful for landscape photography too, although an aperture as wide as f1.8 means that it can also be used for shooting indoors and in other lower light situations. Useful. Let's start by looking at its build quality. The design of Nikon Z mount lenses has been pretty homogeneous so far, and this one is no exception at all. It's quite large and its design is plain and businesslike. The rear of the lens and its mount are made of metal, and we get a weather sealing gasket here too. There's a switch for auto and manual focus, followed by a metallic manual focus ring. It turns very smoothly and it changes your focus quite responsively. As you can see here, there's very little focus breathing when you do. The lens's autofocus motor works silently, but only averagely quickly. The focus mechanism was accurate in my tests, although it didn't always hit focus when I was shooting pictures of people using eye autofocus mode. The rest of the lens's barrel is made of plastic, which is solid enough but doesn't feel quite as high quality as the rear of the lens. Something else to notice is that this lens does not feature a control ring, just a manual focus ring, and it does not have image stabilization, although most new Nikon cameras do nowadays. The lens comes with a cloth pouch and a lens hood, which is also made of plastic. Overall, it's quite a plain lens in its design, but it is solid enough and works well. So let's take a look at image quality. We'll be testing it on a Nikon Z7 camera, which has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor and a 20 megapixel APS-C mode too. Well, let's start in full frame mode. At f1.8, sharpness and contrast in the middle of your images is very good, but not perfect. In the image corners, we see some darkness, even with in-camera corrections turned on, as they are here. However, we're still seeing a good level of detail being captured, a good amount of sharpness here. Let's stop down to f2.8. We only see a slight improvement in sharpness and contrast in the corners. Back in the middle, we see a very good improvement in sharpness and contrast though, and stop down to f4 for perfect image quality there. Over in the corners, we see another improvement in brightness and contrast at f4. The image stays this sharp down to f8, although stopping down to f11 or f16 will soften your image due to the effect of diffraction. So overall, considering that we're working on a 45 megapixel full frame camera here, the lens generally produces pretty sharp pictures, although its image quality does benefit from being stopped down a little in critical situations. Now let's see how the lens performs in APS-C mode for anyone who's using one of Nikon's APS-C Z mount cameras. These shots are 20 megapixels in resolution. At f1.8, again, we see very good sharpness and contrast, although it's not quite pin sharp. The corner image quality just looks averagely sharp here. f2.8 looks the same in the corners, but the middle looks a touch sharper now. At f4, there's even a tiny bit more contrast in the middle, leaving us with perfect picture quality here. The corners look just a tiny bit sharper at f4 and remain this sharp down to f8. Again, of course, stop down to f11 or darker and you'll see softness creeping in from the effect of diffraction. So on APS-C cameras, it's a fairly good performance, although you do need to stop down the aperture for best image quality in the corners. Now let's see about distortion and vignetting in full frame mode. These pictures are taken with in-camera corrections turned off. We see some barrel distortion here. It's not out of control, but it's noticeable. More noticeable is the vignetting at f1.8. Stop down to f2.8 to see it greatly reduced, and at f4 that vignetting is mostly gone. Now let's move on and see about close-up image quality. The lens can focus down to 25cm, so that's quite useful for smaller subjects. At f1.8, the close-up image quality is slightly soft. Stop down to f2.8 and it's much sharper though, and f4 looks excellent. For any wide-angle lens, it is important to be able to handle bright lights. This lens presents just an average performance here. We see a loss of contrast with very bright lights in the pictures and also some clear flaring, but it is quite gentle. It's technically a flaw, but a pretty one nonetheless. And while we're shooting in the dark, let's take a look at chroma levels. At f1.8, we don't see too much in the way of chroma smearing, although bright points of light show an edge of purple fringing. Stop down to f2.8 and f4 to see that reduced. You don't see any sunstars at f4, but stop down to f5.6 and some very small but quite pretty sunstars finally appear. Now let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh. At f1.8 it's possible to get noticeably out of focus backgrounds here, although obviously an f1.4 lens would do better. As for the quality of those backgrounds, they're very nice and soft. I'm pretty impressed actually, they look great. And related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration. Let's take a look. At f1.8 we see some quite strong colour fringing on bokeh highlights, which is reduced at f2.8, and at f4 it's gone. Overall then, generally we are working with a very sharp 24mm lens here, with pretty pleasing image quality in most areas. When used on a 24MP full frame camera, its images will look truly fantastic. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it achieves greatness on a higher resolution camera, it's just very good, a solid workhorse of a prime lens. The biggest question mark in my mind comes to the lens's price. Its quality is not quite spectacular enough to be an f1.8 lens that's also worth £1,000, but it's not far off. It's definitely quite an enjoyable lens to use, so if you're happy to spend that amount of money on it, it does come recommended.